The crystalline ruins of Veridian Prime. Refracted plasma fire into 1,000. Dancing ghosts turning the battlefield into something between a light show and a funeral pyre. Kale Torvin crouched behind what had once been a refinery wall, now just a twisted sculpture of metal and regret, and tried to remember why anyone thought this particular rock was worth dying for. The moon hung in contested space like a bruise that wouldn't heal, purple atmosphere thick enough to taste, thin enough to make every breath feel borrowed. Contact 300. Rivera's voice crackled through his helmet. Calm 406. Ascendancy skirmishers, they're using that weird shimmer thing again. Kale swung his rifle right, catching the telltale distortion of active camouflage bleeding through Veridian's mineral-heavy air. 6 years of this war had taught him to see what wasn't quite there. He squeezed off 3 rounds, heard one satisfying cry, watched 2 more shimmer shapes scatter toward better cover. The weird shimmer thing has a technical name, Kale said, moving before return fire could find him. It's called phased light refraction. I'm calling it the weird shimmer thing until they stop trying to kill me with it. Fair point. Kale dropped into a crater that smelled like ozone and burnt plastic, checked his ammunition counter. 38 rounds, which was either plenty or nowhere near enough depending on how optimistic you were feeling, and risked a glance at the objective. The temple rose from Veridian's surface like something that had grown there rather than been built, all obsidian curves and angles that hurt to look at directly. Ascendancy architecture always seemed designed by people who'd learned geometry from fever dreams. 9th Division, sound off, Kale ordered. 8 voices responded, which meant he'd lost Martinez somewhere in the last push. Damn, Martinez had been 3 weeks from rotation home. We're 200 m from the primary structure. Intelligence says their command node is inside, which means either we take it or we die trying, and I'm really hoping for option 1 because I've got a terrible hangover, and dying seems like it would make it worse. Someone laughed, probably Chen. Chen laughed at everything, which was either a superb coping mechanism or a sign of deep psychological damage. Possibly both. They moved in pairs, using the crystalline formations for cover, and Kale felt it again, that pull in his chest like a fishhook buried somewhere behind his sternum, tugging him toward the temple. He'd felt it since landing, getting stronger with every meter they advanced. Probably adrenaline, or maybe something in the atmosphere, or maybe he was finally cracking after 6 years of fighting a war nobody could adequately explain. The official line was territorial dispute. The real line was that 73 years ago someone died, and everyone had been too angry to ask good questions before the shooting started. Sir, their defense perimeter just collapsed, Rivera said, pulling up beside him. She had dirt on her face, and that expression she got when the universe stopped making sense, which lately was most of the time. They're pulling back into the temple. All of them. Kale checked his tactical display. She was right. The ascendancy forces were withdrawing, not retreating. Exactly, more like being pulled by strings, organized, deliberate, but wrong in a way that made his combat instinct scream. Could be rallying for a counterattack, he said, not believing it. Could be they're inviting us into a kill box, Rivera countered. Could be they're ordering pizza. I don't know, sir, but I don't like it. Your objection is noted and ignored. We push Forward, because what else could they do? Turn back after losing Martinez and 4 others getting this far, go home, and explain that they retreated because the enemy was acting weird. They crossed the final stretch of open ground and nothing shot at them. That was worse. Somehow, Cale's boots crunched on ground that glittered with fragments of crystal and spent ammunition casings, and that feeling in his chest intensified until it was almost painful. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. The temple door stood 30 m high, covered in symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Then the doors opened, not blasted open, not breached. Opened smooth and silent, like someone had been waiting to welcome guests. Light spilled out, golden and warm. Completely wrong for a military installation in the middle of a firefight. Cale raised his fist, halting his squad, and stared as a figure emerged through the light and smoke. Is that Chen started? Yes, Rivera. Breath. The Empress herself walked onto the battlefield. Cale had seen intelligence photos, grainy and distant, but they'd captured her like trying to photograph the ocean by taking a picture of a single wave. She moved through the chaos of the battlefield like it was a garden, and she was late for tea, and every ascendancy soldier in sight had dropped to one knee, weapons lowered, heads bowed. Her armor looked grown rather than forged, black as deep space with veins of light running through it like captured starlight. Her skin was pale enough to seem luminous against the violet atmosphere, and her hair fell in a cascade of pure black past her shoulders, but it was her ears that marked her as truly other. Long and elegant, sweeping back from her skull in graceful points that caught the light. So that's the Empress, Rivera said. She's coming right at us. Cale finished because she was walking directly toward their position, ignoring the weapons trained on her from 3 different angles, and his finger was on the trigger, but he couldn't make himself fire. Sir, Rivera's voice had gone tight. Orders. The Empress was close enough now that Cale could see her eyes, violet deep enough to drown in, and fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart stutter. Not him as a soldier, not him as a target, him specifically, like she could see through his armor and skin and bones to something underneath. Hold fire, he heard himself say. Everyone hold fire. She stopped 3 m away, and the entire battlefield held its breath. Up close she was devastating, not beautiful in any simple way, but rather like watching a storm approach over open water, terrible and magnificent, and impossible to look away from. Those pointed ears framed a face that was almost human, close enough to be familiar, different enough to remind him that vast distances separated their peoples in ways that went beyond light years. Then she reached out, her hand moving with deliberate slowness, and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Her grip was gentle but absolute, and the moment her skin touched his, something broke open in his mind like a dam giving way. You've returned, she said, and her voice was music and breaking glass, and she spoke in perfect Terran standard, and somewhere in a place he'd never been, with stars he'd never seen, someone who wasn't him, remembered promises made beneath twin moons. Cale's legs forgot how to work, and the only thing keeping him standing was her hand on his wrist, and 6 years of combat training that made standing upright a reflex. I think, Rivera said carefully from somewhere behind him, we might need to Reconsider our tactical approach. Time moved like honey dripping upward. Kale watched Liara across the distance. Between them and each step taken, eternity or perhaps no time at all. Physics had clearly filed for divorce. From this particular moment and moved to a different planet. Behind him he could hear Rivera breathing too fast and Chen muttering what might have been prayers or profanities. Honestly, in Chen's case, they were usually the same thing. The Ascendancy soldiers had formed two perfect lines, creating a corridor through the battlefield debris, and they stood motionless as carved stone. Their armor bore symbols that pulsed with bioluminescent light, making them look less like soldiers and more like some kind of warrior monks who'd taken very aggressive vows. Kale's tactical display was having a nervous breakdown, trying to classify them as threats, allies, or decorative obstacles. She's really committed to this entrance. Rivera whispered through the calm, "I respect the dedication to drama." That's shut up, Rivera, just saying. Sir, most people trying to kill us don't usually walk up like they're arriving fashionably late to diplomatic reception. Liara wore armor that seemed woven from darkness and starlight, which sounded like the kind of poetic nonsense people wrote in bad romance novels. Except Kale was looking right at it and couldn't think of better words. Material flowed like liquid when she moved, but where plasma fire reflected off it in the smoky air, it turned hard as diamond. Symbols traced themselves along her arms in scripts that predated human writing by millennia, glowing soft gold against the black. Her hair moved despite the lack of wind, and that was deeply unsettling in ways Kale's brain refused to properly process. Those elongated ears swept back from her skull with the kind of elegant geometry that made human anatomy look like a rough draft. She was taller than him by maybe 2 in, and moved with the kind of grace that suggested she knew exactly where every molecule of air around her was located, and had politely asked them to get out of her way. Weapons check, Kale said, because he needed something concrete to hold on to before his mind slid completely sideways. Everyone confirm. Ready status. 8 voices reported back. 8 rounds still in magazines. 8 fingers still on triggers. 8 hearts still beating. Good, that was good. That was normal and real and made sense, unlike the Empress of the Ascendancy walking toward him like she was returning from a brief trip to the market. She was close enough now that Kale could smell something that reminded him of night-blooming flowers, except he'd never actually smelled night-blooming flowers because he'd spent the last 6 years on military vessels and combat drops. His olfactory system was clearly making things up, possibly in self-defense. The violet light of Viridian Prime turned her pale skin into something luminous. Her eyes locked onto his, and they were the color of deep space nebulae, and Kale had the sudden irrational certainty that she could see every lie he'd ever told and every fear he'd never admitted, and possibly what he'd had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. Chen, he said quietly. Yes, sir. If this goes badly, tell my sister I died doing something heroic, not standing here like an idiot while an alien Empress walks up to me. Will do. Sir, should I specify what kind of heroic thing? Make something up. She'll appreciate the creativity. Liara stopped exactly 3M away, and Kale's ranging laser confirmed it was precisely 3M, not 3.1 or 2.9, and that level of Exact precision was somehow more unnerving than anything else. She studied him with an expression he couldn't read, something between recognition and sorrow, and a desperate hope that made his chest ache in sympathy despite every combat instinct, screaming at him to do something, anything besides stand here feeling things. Her honor guard had followed at a respectful distance, and they were significantly more terrifying up close. Each wore armor that looked grown from the same dark material as Liara's, but theirs bore different symbols, older ones, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. One of them was easily 7 ft tall, another snorts had modifications along their arms that might have been cybernetics, or might have been something else entirely. I'm getting some serious final boss encounter energy here, Rivera muttered. Rivera, I swear to every star in the sector, just managing my stress through humor, sir. Standard military protocol. Liara's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She'd heard Rivera, which meant either her hearing was exceptional or their comms weren't as secure as advertised. Kale was betting on both. Her gaze hadn't left his face, and standing under that focused attention felt like being examined by something vast and ancient that was trying very hard to be gentle about it. She raised one hand, and every human soldier tensed. The movement was slow, deliberate, theatrical in its carefulness. Her fingers extended toward him, and Kale could see the faint shimmer of some kind of energy field around them. Protective or threatening, he couldn't tell which. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the universe had given up on making sense entirely. Commander Kale Torvin, she said, and hearing his name in her voice did something strange to his spine. The words came out in perfect Terran standard with an accent he couldn't place, like she'd learned the language from ancient recordings. I have searched for you across 73 years and 17 star systems. I have built an empire and waged a war and torn the sky itself looking for the shape of your soul. And now you stand before me wearing a different face and carrying a different name, and you do not remember. Ma'am, Kale said, because his mouth had apparently decided to keep working, even though his brain had filed for early retirement. I think you might have me confused with someone else. I've only been alive for 32 years, and I've spent exactly 0 of them searching for you. Your body is 32 years old, Liara said. Your soul is much older, and it remembers even if your mind does not. That's definitely not in the operational briefing, Rivera offered helpfully. Liara took another step forward, closing the distance to 2M, then 1, and Kale's finger tightened on his trigger, but he still couldn't fire. Her hand reached out and wrapped around his wrist, her fingers finding the gap between his glove and sleeve where bare skin met air, and the moment she touched him, reality folded sideways. A balcony, twin moons rising, the weight of formal clothes he'd never worn, a voice, his voice but not his voice, laughing at something she'd said, the taste of wine that didn't exist, her hand in his, exactly like this, and a promise being made that he couldn't quite hear but felt in every cell. Kale gasped and nearly dropped his rifle. The vision lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt like drowning in someone else's memories. You've returned, Liara said, and there were tears forming in those impossible violet eyes. After all this time, you finally come back to me. I really Think, Kale managed, his voice sounding strange in his own ears, that there's been a significant administrative error somewhere. Liara's grip on his wrist remained gentle but absolutely immovable. And Kale had the distinct impression that if he tried to pull away, he'd sooner tear his own arm off than break her hold. Her thumb rested against his pulse point, and he wondered if she could feel his heart trying to escape through his rib. Kale, you came to my world 73 years ago, she said, speaking only to him despite the 100 armed soldiers within earshot. You were part of the first human delegation, a scholar and diplomat named Aaron Voss. You were supposed to stay for 3 months. You stayed for 2 years. Because we couldn't bear to let you leave and you couldn't bear to go. That's a lovely story, Kale said, his mouth operating on autopilot while his brain tried to restart. But I'm fairly certain I would remember being alive 73 years ago. I'm not great with dates, but I'm pretty good with centuries. You died, Liara continued, and her voice cracked on the word, a shuttle accident during your return journey to the coalition border. 17 people lost. The humans blamed our navigation protocols. We blamed human carelessness. Neither side was willing to admit it was simply a malfunction, a random cruelty of an uncaring universe. Because grief is easier to carry when you can point it at someone. Behind Kale, Rivera made a small sound. Everyone knew the story of the delegation disaster. It was literally day one material at the academy, the inciting incident that turned first contact into first blood, but the official records never mentioned names, just casualty numbers and political fallout. Ma'am Empress, Your Majesty, I don't know the proper protocol here, Kale said, but I'm just a commander with a drinking problem and questionable life choices. I've never been a scholar or diplomat. I barely passed my xenocultural sensitivity training. Your soul remembers what your mind has forgotten, Liara insisted. A breeze that shouldn't exist in this thin atmosphere stirred her hair, carrying that scent of impossible flowers. We believe, my people believe, that consciousness transcends individual incarnations, that the core of what makes you yourself continues beyond death, finding new vessels, new lives, but retaining essential patterns. That's reincarnation, Chen said from somewhere behind them. Boss, she's talking about space reincarnation. Thank you, Chen. I gathered that. Just making sure we're all on the same page regarding the metaphysical implications of the current tactical situation, sir. Liara's eyes never left Kale's face, and he felt pinned there like a specimen under glass. Her other hand came up, moving slowly, enough that he could track every centimeter, and she pressed her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. Even through his armor he felt the contact like a brand. You loved philosophy, she said. You would argue about the nature of consciousness for hours, insisting that humans had moved beyond such superstitions, that death was simply cessation. And I would tell you that your people's abandonment of such knowledge was a tragedy, that you'd severed yourselves from understanding the deeper patterns of existence. Another flash, sitting across from her at a table that floated without visible support, cups of something steaming between them, and his voice, not his voice, saying something about empirical evidence while she laughed. The memory tasted real in a way that made his current reality feel thin, Stop that, Kale said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or his own traitorous brain. I'm not doing anything, Liara said. Your memories are surfacing on there. The soul recognizes its own history, even when the mind denies it. My soul needs to calm down and let my tactical assessment capabilities handle this. But you always used humor when you were uncomfortable, Liara said, and something in her expression softened. You made a joke about thermodynamics. The first time I told you I loved you. Do you remember? You said that entropy would claim us all eventually, so we might as well enjoy the descent into disorder together. Kale didn't remember, absolutely didn't remember, except there was something tugging at the edges of his thoughts, a sense of having said exactly those words while standing on a balcony under stars that weren't so, holding hands with someone whose ears came to elegant points. This is insane, he said. Weakly, yes, Liara agreed. Love often is. I meant the reincarnation thing. That too. The ascendancy forces had begun. A low rhythmic sound, something between chanting and harmonic resonance, that made the ground vibrate beneath Kale's boots. His tactical display was throwing error messages, unable to classify whether this was a threat, display, or religious ceremony, or possibly both. The temple behind Liara pulsed with light in time to the chanting, and that probably wasn't concerning at all. Empress, one of her honor guards, said, stepping forward. They were the 7'1", and their voice resonated like struck metal. The council demands your return to the fleet. This exposure is unacceptable. The council can wait, Liara said, without looking away from Kale. I have waited 73 years. They can manage 10 more minutes. With respect, the humans could execute you where you stand. They won't, Liara said with absolute certainty. He won't let them. Kale opened his mouth to point out that he absolutely would let them if it meant completing the mission and getting his people home safely, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers still rested on his trigger. He still had a clear shot. Empress or not, she was exposed, vulnerable, and taking her captive or eliminating her would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the entire war. He couldn't do it. You remember the garden, Liara said softly. The one behind the Eastern Palace wing. There was a tree there that bloomed only once every 11 years, and we were lucky enough to be there during the flowering. You said it smelled like rain and cinnamon and something you couldn't name. You took samples to analyze, but the chemistry didn't match the experience. You said some things couldn't be reduced to their component parts without losing what made them meaningful. The scent hit him, rain and cinnamon and something indescribable, and suddenly he was there, standing beneath branches heavy with flowers that glowed in the dark, and her hand was in his, and he was trying to explain analytical methodology while she laughed at his insistence on quantifying beauty. Stop, Kale said, and his voice came out rough. Please stop. I can't. Lyra said, I've crossed too many stars to stop now. I found you again, Aaron. Against all probability, all logic, I found you. My name is Kale. Your name in this life is Kale, she corrected gently, but names are temporary things, souls are not. She reached into a compartment in her armor and withdrew something small enough to fit in her palm. When she activated it, a holographic projection bloomed in the air between Them two figures on that balcony under those twin moons, and one of them had Cale's face. Not identical, but close enough that Rivera swore behind him the other figure was unmistakably Lyra, though perhaps slightly younger, and they stood with their hands intertwined and their foreheads pressed together in a moment of such profound intimacy that Cale felt like a voyeur witnessing it. This was the night before you left, Lyra said. You promised you would return, you said. 6 months, a year at most, you said. Nothing could keep you away. Hologram Aaron spoke, and Cale heard his own voice saying words he'd never spoken. I'll find my way back to you, even if I have to cross every star. Between here and home, I'll come back. Well, Rivera said into the ringing silence that followed, that's significantly more complicated than our usual combat situations. Admiral Zhang's voice crackled through Cale's helmet, calm with all the warmth of a supernova detonation. Commander Torin, status report. Now. Cale stared at the hologram still floating between him and Lyra, at his own face wearing an expression he'd never made, and tried to figure out how to explain this in any way that wouldn't get him court-martialed or committed to psychiatric evaluation. Possibly both. Status is complicated. Sir, he managed. Complicated how? Our scans show you're standing 3 m from the primary enemy combatant with your weapon lowered. Please tell me you're negotiating her surrender. It's more of an ongoing philosophical discussion about the nature of consciousness and reincarnation, sir. The silence that followed could have suffocated planets. Repeat that. Commander, I don't think I heard you correctly over the sound of my career ending. Lyra's honor guard had formed a defensive perimeter, but their weapons remained lowered, pointed at nothing. The 7FT-1 kept glancing at the sky like they expected orbital strikes any second. Honestly, Cale was half expecting the same thing. Around them, the crystalline ruins of Veridian Prime continued smoking because the universe didn't care about personal crises enough to provide dramatic weather changes. The Empress believes I'm the reincarnation of a human diplomat who died 73 years ago, Cale said, watching his career evaporate in real time. The diplomat who died in the accident that started this war. She has evidence that's extremely compelling in ways I don't fully understand and don't particularly want to. Commander, are you experiencing any symptoms of psychic influence, hallucinations, memory alteration, sudden urges to defect, just the usual combat stress and existential dread, sir? Also, there's a hologram of someone with my face making promises to her under alien moons, which is definitely not helping my mental state. Rivera had moved up beside him, her rifle still trained vaguely in Lyra's direction, but without any real conviction behind it. Sir, permission to speak freely. Granted, Zhang said. This is either the most elaborate honey trap in military history, or we're witnessing something that's going to require entirely new sections in the first Contact Protocols Manual. Your assessment is noted, Lieutenant, and somehow makes this situation worse. Lyra had closed the hologram, but the afterimage remained burned into Kaiden's retinas. Her expression held something between hope and devastation, like she was watching someone she loved drowning while standing just out of reach. Her hand still rested against his chest, and he could feel his heartbeat hammering against her palm. My war council is demanding my immediate return, Liara said, loud enough for the comms to catch. They believe this is tactically unsound. They're correct. I'm exposing myself to capture or execution for the possibility of something that defies all military logic. Finally, someone making sense, Zhang muttered, but I don't care, Liara continued. I've commanded fleets and conquered systems and held an empire together through force of will for 73 years, and none of it has mattered because the one thing I wanted was gone. If there's even the smallest chance that Aaron's soul has returned, I will take any risk, accept any consequence to speak with him again. That's extremely romantic, Chen offered, also tactically insane, but points for commitment. The Kale felt another memory surface, this one sharper than the others, sitting in what might have been a council chamber while Liara argued with advisors who wanted to restrict his access to sensitive areas, her voice rising in that same passionate intensity, declaring that love required trust, that building bridges between species meant taking risks that calculations couldn't quantify. And his voice, Aaron's voice, quietly supporting her, pointing out that fear of vulnerability would doom any chance of real connection. I need to think, Kale said, though thinking seemed beyond his capabilities. At the moment, I need everyone to stop talking and shooting and making life-altering revelations for approximately 5 minutes. Negative. Commander Zhang said, you have 30 seconds to secure the hostile or withdraw to safe distance. Those are your only options, Admiral. With respect, I'm not sure either of those options accounts for the current situation's complexity. Then make it simple. That's what we pay you for. The Liara's fingers tightened slightly against his chest. I can feel your confusion, she said softly. Your heart knows what your mind refuses to accept. I'm not asking you to understand everything immediately. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that some truths transcend the limitations of a single lifetime. In my experience, truths that transcend limitations usually come with significant paperwork requirements, Kale said, also questioning from intelligence services, also therapy. So much therapy, you're deflecting with humor again. It's one of my better coping mechanisms. You should see the bad ones, something that might have been. A smile crossed her face. I remember those too. You once got drunk on Viridian wine and tried to explain orbital mechanics using dinner plates. You dropped 3 plates and blamed gravity for being unreliable. Kale didn't remember that. He absolutely didn't. Except he could suddenly recall the exact weight of those plates, the way they'd felt leaving his hands. Liara's laughter echoing through dining hall filled with beings whose names he'd never learned. The memory sat in his mind like something that belonged there, comfortable and familiar and completely impossible. Commander, 20 seconds, Jiang warned. Behind Liara, her war council materialized as holographic projections, tall figures in elaborate armor who radiated disapproval like heat from a reactor core. One of them spoke in their own language, rapid and harsh, and Liara responded without looking away from Kale. Whatever she said made them flare brighter, angrier, but they didn't interrupt again. They want me to return, Liara translated. They're reminding me that I'm Empress, that I have responsibilities to billions of lives, that I cannot risk everything for Personal sentiment, they're correct. About all of it, but Kale prompted. Because there was definitely a but. Coming. But I didn't build this empire to serve. I built it to be strong enough to search for you, every fleet, every conquest, every star system brought. Under our control, it was all. Infrastructure for the search I've had. Operatives monitoring human birth. Records across 17 colonies for decades. Looking for any sign of pattern. Recognition, unusual memories, anything that might indicate Aaron's soul had found a new home. That's dedication, Rivera said, also. Maybe a little concerning from a privacy standpoint. 10 seconds, Commander Zhang snapped. Kale looked at Lyra, at those violet eyes that held 73 years of grief and hope and absolute certainty, and felt the weight of 2 civilizations worth of consequences pressing down on his shoulders. His training said secure the target. His instincts said this was a trap. His orders said withdraw. His heart said something else entirely. I'll make you a deal, Kale heard himself say. You stand down your forces. Complete ceasefire, and I'll agree to talk with you somewhere neutral, without weapons, without armies, just 2 people trying to figure out if the universe is insane or if we are. Commander, you don't have authority to. Zhang started. Done, Lyra said. Immediately. She turned to her holographic council and spoke in their language, her voice carrying absolute authority that made her honor guard. Straighten. The chanting stopped. The temple's pulsing light dimmed, and across Viridian Prime's battlefield, every ascendancy weapon powered down. Perfect synchronization. The temple interior made Kale's eyes hurt in ways that suggested geometry had filed a restraining order against this architecture. Walls curved into themselves while somehow remaining structurally sound, and the lighting came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. His tactical instincts screamed that this was the worst possible terrain for an ambush, which meant either Lyra was sincere or he was about to have a very educational final few seconds of life. Your people are having collective heart attacks right now, Rivera had said before he'd walked inside. Just so you know, Admiral Zhang's blood pressure is probably visible from orbit. Tell them I died heroically, Kale had replied. You already used that line, sir. Come up with new material. Now he stood in what Liara called the Hall of Echoes, which sounded ominous, but mostly just looked like someone had let an artist with too much budget and not enough supervision design a museum. Columns rose toward a ceiling he couldn't quite focus on, covered in scripts that predated human writing by millennia. Holographic displays floated at intervals, showing star charts and historical records and things that might have been equations or poetry, or possibly both. Liara had removed her armor, and that somehow made her more intimidating rather than less. She wore simple clothes in deep blue that made her pale skin seem to glow, and without the military trappings she looked simultaneously younger and infinitely older. Those elegant ears caught the strange light, and Kale found himself staring at them, trying to reconcile the alienness with how fundamentally human the rest of her appeared. This is where we keep our records of soul journeys, Liara said, gesturing to the holographic displays. Documented cases spanning 12,000 years of observation. Your people abandoned this knowledge somewhere in your early industrial age, decided that empirical materialism was the only valid framework for understanding consciousness. But we prefer our existential crises to come with peer-reviewed studies, Kale said, studying a display that showed branching patterns connecting hundreds of individuals across centuries. This is claiming that consciousness persists across deaths and rebirths with measurable consistency. Yes, the patterns are subtle but verifiable, specific phobias with no environmental cause, innate skills that require no training, recognition of places never visited, and in rare cases, direct memory transfer, though those are fragmentary at best. She pulled up another display showing brain scans and energy readings that meant nothing to Kale. Your scientists dismissed it as confirmation bias and coincidence. My people have built an entire understanding of existence around it, and you think I'm this Aaron Voss because I have his face? No, I think you're Aaron because the moment I touched you, I felt the same resonance I felt 73 years ago. Because your soul carries patterns that match the records we kept of him. Because when I speak of our past, your heart recognizes truths your mind hasn't yet accepted. She moved closer and Kale didn't step back. And because you haven't left, if you truly believed this was delusion or manipulation, you would have withdrawn. But you're still here, searching for answers to questions you're afraid to ask. More memories surface, coming faster now, walking through this very hall with Lyra, explaining the philosophy behind soul recognition, arguing about the scientific method, while she challenged him to explain love and consciousness using only physical processes, lying together on a terrace under stars, talking about whether continuity of experience mattered more than continuity of memory. This is terrifying, Kale admitted. I came here to fight a war. I expected plasma fire and tactical objectives and maybe dying heroically while completing the mission. I did not expect cosmic romance and metaphysical complications. Life rarely gives us what we expect, Liara said. Aaron didn't expect to fall in love with an alien empress. I didn't expect to spend 73 years grieving someone who promised to return. And yet here we are, standing in the same hall where I first told him that our people's differences were superficial compared to what connected us. What did he say? He quoted entropy, statistics, and made a joke about heat, death. Her expression softened with remembered fondness. Then he admitted he was terrified of how much he felt that loving someone across such vast differences seemed like cosmically bad planning. I told him the universe didn't plan anything, but that didn't make the connections less real. Kale felt the weight of two lives pressing against each other, trying to occupy the same space. He was commander Kale Torvin, career military, 6 years of combat experience, someone who'd chosen structure and duty because they were quantifiable and reliable. But underneath that, or maybe woven through, it was something else, echoes of a man who'd crossed the stars for knowledge and found something he couldn't categorize or control. If I accept this, Kale said slowly, if I believe that some part of me is Aaron Voss, what does that mean? Do I stop being Kale? Do his memories overwrite mine? Do I become some hybrid consciousness that doesn't belong anywhere? You become whoever you choose to become, Liara said. The past informs the present, but it doesn't dictate it. Aaron made his choices. You'll make yours. I'm not asking you to be him. I'm asking you to acknowledge the connection between you and decide what to do with it. And the war was always about grief that couldn't find proper outlet. I've known that for decades, but couldn't stop it because stopping would mean admitting he was truly gone. If you choose to walk away, to return to your fleet and never speak to me again, I'll order a complete withdrawal. No more fighting, no more deaths. I'll end what I should have ended 70 years ago. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone. Kale said, what if I'm not him? What if your soul recognition is just really advanced pattern matching and confirmation bias? Then I'll have made a fool of myself in front of two armies and finally found a reason to stop fighting. She smiled, and it was genuine despite the sadness threading through it. Either way, something good comes from this. Then Kale walked to one of the displays, watching light trace connections between lives separated by centuries. The science in him wanted to dismiss it as sophisticated mythology, but the memories kept coming. Her laugh, the taste of that wine, the weight of promises made under alien stars. Not hallucinations or implanted suggestions, but something that felt like remembering, like finding pieces of himself he hadn't known were missing. I don't know what I am, he said finally. I don't know if I'm Aaron reborn or Kale having a psychotic break or something else entirely, but I remember things I shouldn't. I feel things that don't make sense. And when you touch me, it feels like coming home after a very long deployment. Liara's breath caught. That's enough. That's more than enough. I'm still going to make terrible jokes. When I'm uncomfortable, I'm counting on it. And then I'm keeping my name. Kale works for me. Kale, she repeated, testing it. I can work with Kale, and we're going to need so much therapy, both of us. Possibly couples therapy, which is insane because we just met, except we didn't, except we did. This is going to require new categories of psychological support. She laughed, and the sound filled the hall like music. Aaron said something similar. He wanted to establish formal protocols for interspecies relationship counseling. I told him he was overthinking it. Sounds like he was smart. He was. You are. She closed the distance between them, moving slowly enough that he could step back if he wanted. He didn't want. Her hand found his again, and this time the memories that surfaced felt less like drowning and more like surfacing. So, what happens now? Kale looked at her, at the Empress who'd waged war for grief, who'd searched across decades and star systems for a soul she refused to believe was gone, who was looking at him like he held every answer she'd been seeking. He thought about duty and orders and the weight of two civilizations' expectations. Then he thought about promises made under twin moons and the strain mathematics of consciousness that couldn't be reduced to component parts. Now, he said, we figure out how to explain this to Admiral Zhang without anyone getting court-martialed. Then we work on ending a war that should have ended 73 years ago, and somewhere in there you tell me more about this Aaron person, and I'll try to figure out where he ends and I begin, and after that we see if cosmic romance survives the reality of post-war bureaucracy and interspecies diplomatic complications. He smiled, but given that you waited 73 years, I figure we can handle some paperwork. She kissed him then, and it felt like remembering and discovering simultaneously, like every promise ever made and every choice yet to be taken. When they broke apart, Cal was grinning despite everything. That's going to make the mission report really complicated, he said. Worth it, he looked at her at the hope and love and terrible patience written across her face and felt something in his chest click into place that he hadn't known was misaligned. Yeah, Cal said, worth it.